Jessica Pettitt, and we are back. And we're going to talk today about Chapter 7, the intelligence community. And I'm lucky enough to have my friend Dylan, who stupidly said, yeah, sure, I guess I'll read the chapter. Sure. So, Dylan, thank you very much for being here. Just off the top of your head, because I am introvert trained, there's not a lot of top off your head. On the top of your notes that you probably have pre prepared, is there anything that you want to kick off that's a real standout from reading the chapter?
Well, I think what stood out to me most really on reading it is how much it really the things in this chapter affect like our civil liberties and actually
Those
doesn't
little things.
talk about it at all. And so
Uh-huh.
that's what I'm interested in finding out what you think about that since I know you also read it. So that's sort of like one of the main things that stuck out to me is thinking about how uh some of the things in this chapter actually impact our day-to-day kind of moving through the world.
That's totally cool, and I'm assuming we will both do that. What is fascinating to me, if the intention of making these recordings is that at some point somebody not blood related to me might be bored enough that they're watching them, the thing that's I'm going to use like a lowercase a alarming is there's so many different departments and agencies in the government that I didn't really understand what they did, and I actually am paying attention.
Mhm.
So for people who aren't paying attention, this is so easy to be overwhelmed and like, oh, right. So we're trying to demystify here, right? So the intelligence community, first off, I didn't understand this until I actually had a contract with the Department of National Intelligence, which is only one teeny tiny bit of this intelligence community chapter. It's one of many, but inside the Department of National Intelligence is like dozens of different offices. I maybe have heard of some of those offices, but I didn't realize they rolled up to this office, which then rolls up to this Chapter
Mhm.
7 office. So
Yeah.
some of that could very well be evidence that there is bureaucracy and duplication that needs to be examined. And like most of the chapters, I think it's important to reiterate that the mandate for leadership started in 1979 as a conservative response to the incredibly liberal and progressive presidency of Carter,
Mhm.
who had like solar panels on the White House. Um, so they've had 4 years during Biden's current administration to write this, but there's not that much different in this particular document than in 1979. Now, to your point around civil liberties, what I found fascinating is that the biggest changes really happened around 9/11.
Mhm.
And so then, if we, instead of 1979, if we go to 2002, 2002 on, there really hasn't been that many changes. And to your point, I don't know that most people even know this, that these things have been on the docket for a very, very long time, just awaiting the right opportunity to have some adjustments. Um, and most of those adjustments, I think, are lower access to privacy or civil liberty that most I would say most people who are in the United States are benefiting from currently to the point they probably don't even realize it's something that could be taken away. So I do think it's a super important point, and I'm totally happy to talk about it. So before we get into the super nitty gritty gritty, the I have been starting with like different quotes or like what I'm
Mhm.
going to refer to as awkward word choices.
Okay.
There's Department of Transportation, for example, had a sentence about the required requirements, and the whole sentence is about it being a requirement to fulfill required requirements, and that we're required to determine what those required requirements are so that we can fulfill our requirements. Like that was a sentence. Proofreaders are alive. But in chapter 7, my favorite is talking about learning from, understanding, and forecasting yesterday and future threats.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to go on a limb and say that we do not know all of the future threats, and we can't really identify when they are going to start or when they are going to end. But I felt like it was being positioned that that is its main job is to eradicate yesterday's threats. That doesn't seem to be working out well. predict and eradicate potentially in advance any future threats. So if that's the kind of overarching Heritage Foundation mandate for leadership mission creep of the intelligence community, then that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this chapter.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
no, I don't think that's just in the awkward wording. I mean, they very specifically use that phrase future threats multiple times throughout the chapter too. Super important to bring up. And I guess that's like the concern with like the our civil rights, right? Like there's that Tom Cruise movie where they like arrest him before he does a murder. Which is sort of a silly thing to bring up, but the idea of like, right, uh like when do we become a threat? When we're just like having a conversation, um when we or like you know when does that kind of lever shift between just a normal person having a conversation or gathering with people to being like a threat to national security?
Yeah, there's a common kind of like ethical dilemma icebreaker of if you had the opportunity to kill Adolf Hitler as a baby, would you? And in case anyone is playing along, the answer is no, because you don't kill babies,
Mhm.
right? Which is not a slippery slope to talk about abortion or women's health care. But if you don't kill babies, the idea is that that baby has the liberty and the opportunity to become whatever it may become. And once it has become the thing that it has become, then it could suffer the consequences potentially, but not ahead of time. Although it is important to mention, just because we compare Adolf Hitler all the time, Indian law and Jim Crow laws are the ones that taught Adolf Hitler while in prison about this new way of thinking of criminalizing identity development. We taught him that, not the baby. So just, I digress. Okay, so briefly, cyberspace is brought up. This is a different chapter, talks about net neutrality, which is the Federal Communications Commission, and it is now January 9th. The last law was finally overturned to protect neutrality last week. So we are well on the way towards that. But cyberspace, the idea of using cyberspace to gather and share information to also spy, hopefully with good intentions, and to also use cyberspace as a weaponized element of warfare. And then finally, using the same cyberspace, possibly full circling back to intelligence and spying to win or stop warfare. That was my understanding of the intersection between cyberspace and intelligence community. Am I close?
Yeah, and then also kind of not in that exact section, but I think is relevant to that, the idea of integration between the government and commercial
Oh
like
yeah.
I like data cyber data sets and stuff, right? So that the government would start more often than it is leveraging commercial uh sources of information like Meta or Twitter, things like that to inform sort of the decisions they're making at that higher government level.
Which is Meta is a great example, right? Is that we talk about like Russian interference with the election, but we're also asking a private business to dictate what it's going to do and how it's going to check for false information. It's a private business; it can do whatever it wants. Which is Facebook this week coming out and being like, "Say gay people are mentally ill. We're not checking
Mhm.
facts. We're just a platform,"
Yeah.
which is really an excellent role model of claiming community responsibility, I think. Um,
But I mean, even more
that
so
was
like,
sarcasm.
yeah, no, totally. But even more so like, to reduce like government redundancy and bureaucracy, getting rid of like government, uh, government data sources and relying on private companies for
Yes.
like the information, right? Which
Yeah.
is like just like really bonkers to me, or not bonkers. I mean, it is just the evolution of like more and more like private sector influence on the government, I suppose.
I mean, I think you're being charitable. I think it's pretty bonkers because if using this as a weapon and we didn't like it, but we also want to lean on it to use it as a weapon for ourselves or under the guise of free market, that somehow that information would be less biased and more accurate. Um, that that seems bonkers to me. I think this is the technical scientific term. Um,
I'm
okay,
trying to be neutral. No.
you don't have to be. You can be as truthful or non-neutral as you want. I have to find all the differences, and that's only because I'm trying to like eventually have a job. You have a different job. Um, okay, here's another fun sentence. Very similar to the trend in other chapters that involve the words nonpartisan civil servants who are loyal to the president's agenda.
Oh, like how the intelligence community is supposed to be devoid of all political motivations, but
Yes,
then be
except
loyal to the
yeah,
president.
yeah, that's almost everywhere. So
Yeah.
every new president sets a new agenda for the United States.
Mhm.
That seems like a really bad idea. Um, and it's also not nonpartisan civil servants then, right? Because they keep using this word and I don't think they know what it means. So favoring loyalty to the existing president's agenda, no past president's agenda. It's a curious thing, right? And the loop kind of made me think about the congressional debate about getting rid of the filibuster.
Mhm.
And it's really convenient to get rid of it when you don't need it, but you want to keep it in case you ever need it. So there's a lot of those loopies, but I felt like there was more of those loopies here than there were in some of the other chapters. Okay,
Mhm.
so let's start. We're going to get to surveillance. We're going to probably spend most of our time there, but let's start first with the Department of National Intelligence, as I talked off at the beginning, is currently led by John Radcliffe, who was a Texas elected legislator who is pro-Trump and an election denier, and is conveniently also his nominee to head up the CIA, which would make him, if he gets that position, the first person to have worked in the Department of Justice, the Department of National Intelligence, FISA, as well as the CIA, which is interesting to have all that experience. That sounds great. Um, but is similar to these tautological circles. We don't want an insider, we want an outsider, but we like this insider because this insider is, say it with me, loyal to Trump. So
Mhm.
that's where we're at. So let's start first with the CIA, which is supposed to be, to your point, politically neutral, emphasizing professionalism and building trust between its citizenry and the government. However, it also, in the same paragraph, says that it is currently responsible for leaks. It focuses only on media appearances to build influencers and become social media bias makers to
Mhm.
weaponize social media, which, spoiler alert, was the same platform you just suggested that we use. CIA. Go, Dylan. What are your thoughts on CIA?
Um, yeah, I think the part that stood out to me, I mean, right, there's that I mean, this push and pull through the whole thing about like, do we like it? Do we hate it? Um, I think what's interesting on it is the take that like I'm not going to be able to find the part right now, but where it's talking about that the CIA is too like slow to move and um too reflective of past mistakes. Like they don't move fast enough because they're trying to adjust for past mistakes as if
Mhm.
that's like a bad thing. And so we need like new people in there who are gonna like move fast and like do this like future planning or future action, right? So that really
Yeah.
aggressive sort of posturing of like the intelligence apparatus.
And why start learning from history? Like, why would we start doing that? That ties back into the thing we started at the beginning with the yesterday versus future threats, and that's the weakness and the new charge for the CIA.
And I think the other thing, you mentioned it a little bit, but just how much this whole chapter is like tied to 9/11 and
Mhm.
that like I mean we're 20 years past 9/11. I imagine there's been major security threats since
Mhm.
then that like aren't even mentioned in here.
Yeah,
So
but
yeah,
we wouldn't need those because those are backwards.
yeah.
Mhm. So before we get to the surveillance stuff, which is the biggest 9/11 thing, I just want to say that the Department of Justice, their main goal, according to this, should be to improve accountability. And the Hatch Act, which is, I had it pulled up, but now I can't find it, but I believe that it is the legislation that actually monitors privacy and what is allowed and what isn't allowed to be publicly shared or not shared, what's disclosed, what's not disclosed. Um, that is directly tied to surveillance, but it is the only mention of the Department of Justice really in the chapter around how intelligence is used with the Department of Justice. And I am only bringing that up in that obviously there is a Department of Justice as well. That's a different chapter. But through, it seems to me, at least in my conscious memory, um, maybe because of the Hillary laptop, Hunter laptop, Trump and Russia, like it just seems like the Department of Justice, FBI have been very smushed together as far as doing investigative work, and whether that investigative work then leads to charges or does it lead to legislation or Supreme Court cases. I was surprised without really understanding it, but I for some reason thought the intelligence community would fall under the Department of Justice. That's just my wrongness, but they're actually two very separate things. Did you make that same mistake, or are you smarter than me? I mean, we all
I
know
am
that.
not, I mean, I'm not smart. I mean, yeah, I thought I would learn a lot more about the intelligence community reading this than I did. I mean, I
Hmm.
knew the CIA existed. I learned there's 13 different agencies that are involved, but it doesn't actually tell you what they are.
Yeah.
Uh, so uh, the all the connections are still very not clear to me, but in turn, that makes me it makes it very apparent how there's obviously this like uh the Heritage Foundation or the authors in general of this text are not fond of how the CIA has been running the past
Right.
bit of time, because that's what the majority of this chapter, or a fifth of the chapter, really focuses on the CIA and like how they're messed up.
Yeah.
When, they open it saying there's 13 agencies. I can't imagine the 12 other agencies are running perfectly, right?
Hmm. But it really is. I think it's a profound thing to notice, is because a lot of the chapters may have 30 sub-departments and four of them are the focus and one of them really is the main focus.
Mhm.
Some of the chapters, not only will it be so narrow in scope, but it goes off on like you need a therapist. Like there's like 4 pages of the chapter is complaining about one particular person or one particular incident. It's just like a bone to pick or something. It's fascinating because, for at least in my recognition, this is the first presidential election where, if this mandate really has been around since 1979, it's the first time I'd ever even heard of it, and I've heard about it in a sense that was like this kind of dogmatic agenda of what's going to happen in the first 180 days of the next Republicans' presidency. So they've all been set up that way. They just weren't utilized in such a dramatic policy wonk kind of way, and which I find fascinating because a lot of Democrats who have run for office seem to always be critiqued by having ideas and not a plan. And when you can walk around with a 900-page book, it really kind of looks like you have a plan, except the authors didn't talk to each other, and it's usually very personalized what they're complaining about. Tulsi Gabbard is the current suggestion for the nominee to be in charge of the intelligence community, who has public connections with people that the FBI, the Department of Judges, the Department of National Intelligence deem enemies of the United States, but the enemy and her as a legislator really hate the CIA. So I think that's at the root of like this kind of irrational focus on one of many.
Yeah, and the other, like, one of the other main themes that seems very like, oh, this is really bothersome to you, is that the director of national intelligence, the position that Tulsi Gabbard would be in, is like that position's been completely disrespected and like it should have all the power that it needs. And I'm the only one who should be talking to the president about any of this intelligence stuff. So it really is
Right.
this consolidation of of power that they're annoyed that they don't have, it seems.
Yeah, and a gross misunderstanding of how broad a lot of the jobs are. And I do think, again, I said at the beginning, I think that is an interesting opportunity to do a review for duplication or bureaucracy, but it does seem very, very, very short-sighted. Okay, another piece that
Yeah.
gets mentioned, which are a bunch of terms I had never heard of. So I did some Googlings. So here goes. So, like most of the chapters, we are worried about China. That's a cliff notes, right? Focusing on China's Communist Party, it's a major global threat, and the intelligence community has to prioritize on China. Again, to Dylan's point, there are a lot of things that probably need to be focused on, and I don't even know if China really needs to be in the top 10 as far as intelligence issues, but I'm not in charge. That's just what it says. So, it references Quad countries countering China. So I was like, all right, what is a Quad country? So I looked at Australia, India, Japan, and the United States are in cahoots together to create an intelligence community amongst themselves to counter China. Put a pin in it. Couple paragraphs later, Five Eyes, and not I as in the letter, but as in like optic. Five Eyes should expand to nine eyes. That's a sentence. I don't know what Five Eyes or Nine Eyes is, so I Googled it. And Five Eyes is Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and the US. Their Five Eyes are collaboratively spying together and sharing all their spy intelligent information with one another. But it should expand from Five Eyes to Nine Eyes to include the Netherlands, France, Norway, and Germany by sharing all of those information. No other countries, just those. Those are the only ones that we need to pay attention to. So again, not knowing anything about this, number one, I don't know that I would have written that down. Like,
Would you?
I, wouldn't we want to keep that a secret?
No, because it's I mean, isn't it that whole like I mean it's very I mean this whole thing's aggressive and assertive, right? It's saying this is who our real allies are. You
Mhm.
Europeans aren't our allies. I mean, they even say that towards the end in a different section, are our allies in name only, right? And
Right.
so like it's I think it's
I mean,
very aggressively saying this is who our true like who's really on our side.
I would love that to be true. I don't know that those countries know that. Um, the if the Nine Eyes, which includes Netherlands, France, and Norway, expanded to what is referred to as 14 eyes. Notice this is the same document that is saying we are not supposed to have any kind of global presence, pull out of the World Health Organization, pull out of NATO, pull out of the Paris Agreement. But here are now 14 eyes that we should be sharing spy information because we should add Belgium, Spain, Sweden, and Italy. I'm assuming these are places where Trump would like to go on vacation. That seems to be
Well,
the
aren't they all
qualifier.
the countries where the governments are skewing super fascist right now?
Hungary didn't make the list, nor did Venezuela. So I thought that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And then the others, now this is when your head's going to blow up, is Israel, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea. So number one, Japan is already on the list, but thank you for adding it again. And then when we start talking about Singapore or South Korea, those are like wildly in the news right now, especially when we're talking about Taiwan and Hong Kong and what's happening there. And then to list Israel specifically is the only time so far that I can recall that Israel has shown up in Project 2025 is that it is an intelligence sharing key target, but it's under the category of other and not one of the ones that's being articulated. I don't know if that has a meaning or not, but I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very interesting, like, why them sort of question,
Mhm.
why the initial four or whatever.
Yeah, quad counters China, Australia, India, Japan, and US. All right. Well, Facebook this week came up with some new rules about Meta. that it's no longer going to be responsible for fact checking, and it's no longer going to say calling gay people mentally unwell or mentally ill. That's not considered hateful speech. It's protected First Amendment speech. Which, when I first saw that article, it is in this chapter where it was stated that any of these intelligence services are prohibited from monitoring so-called domestic disinformation programs. They must remain impartial. Again, we're back to like loyalist to the agenda, nonpartisan, impartial. They cannot be tracking domestic disinformation under the guise of First Amendment protections, which interestingly gets us to FISA and surveillance, which, from what I could tell, and I am not an expert, but from what I could tell, after 9/11, a lot of these civil liberties, like Dylan, you said at the beginning, were recalled under the guise of we need to spy and find out who done it, and this is the only way to do it. And it was for American citizens. It was people living in the United States. It's American citizens who live abroad, and international people who also have done a lot of work in the United States, like instantly lifted any expectation. So the original, or the most recent, well, let me start at the beginning. Okay, so the original bill that did this expired in 23. This is the House Reforming Intelligence and Securing American Act. Then it went through the Senate and got like revamped up. That was the Security and Freedom Enhancement, which goes through 2027. And there's another act that I can't read, Reform and Reauthorization Act, which now takes the current standards through 2035, because the extended standards that started at 9/11 were up for review this April of 2024. So the current state is the current limitation on privacy and civil liberties. Is there were some more language in the most recent one about being more protective, but it is still widely more open than it was in 2002, and those rules now go through 2035. Ugh. Yeah, I didn't know that. Did you know that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I feel like a really not good consumer of the internet, and uh,
Yeah.
you know, that we're our whole lives out there, and I really have no understanding of like who's looking at it or how that information's being used, both at like a
Mhm.
commercial or private or governmental level.
I think I'm more comfortable assuming that like bad guys are looking at my stuff and there's really nothing I can do about it, and I've just become kind of mentally numb to that. But who are the good guys and what are the good guys doing with my information? Suddenly that gets really creepy, because why are you looking at my stuff? I didn't do nothing wrong. Then all of a sudden it's starting to feel too close. But I
Mm.
don't know that I've thought about it until this chapter, just being completely honest. Okay, so the four main kind of what they want to do, as far what the suggestions are, is looking at analytical information reform. This includes secrets and mysteries. Ooh, I want to work with secrets and mysteries. Um, to stop overclassification and really look at declassification. I think this is interesting to specifically about some of the documents that Trump had in his possession at his house that he'll never see any kind of criminal responsibility for. But the ability to declassify things or new regulation to not have classified it in the first place, I am projecting that that is somehow related, but I don't know that that's true. Looking at data privacy regulations, obviously, and then space warfare. Just throw that in. No
Yeah, just at the
explanation.
end.
Just space warfare. And
I didn't even know we were in space warfare, but if apparently we're like actively in space warfare. So just
are actively trying. Maybe we're actively trying not to be in space warfare.
I think we're trying to be in space warfare.
What does that even mean? I don't. This
Apparently
whole
Russia's
project.
being very aggressive in space right now.
Right, but can't we just stay out of space and then we're fine?
Yeah.
I don't understand. All right, so here is, excuse me, here is the big, terrible pivot. What the hell are we supposed to do about this?
Okay.
So here are some thoughts I have, and then you feel free to add in anything that you want to tell me that I'm nuts or crazy, or come up with some new ideas. First off, you know all the little boxes in the end of all the websites of whether you agree to sell all your cookies or your terms and things like this. I think that might be a really good practice for at least for myself to actually read that box. If I keep reading the boxes, maybe I'll learn about what does that even mean. That's not intelligence specific, but I think that it's probably good practice to read the little boxes before you hit yeah, sure, whatever, I don't care. Um, just speaking from personal habits, that'd be the first thing. Second thing I would think of is if there's a possibility to pull any of your own reports of some sort. Like I think of credit reports as a kind of example, but I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to request your own files. I have no idea. Um, I would assume what's the thing that you can ask FOIA? You can request your own public records. I think it'd be really kind of fascinating under the new administration if we all just individually requested our own governmental file. It sounds like a backlog of annoying information, but I what if they actually have some kind of information that you don't even know that they have? Wouldn't it be nice
Uh,
to know?
Didn't you have you ever heard that old rumor from like activist circles? Like if you ask the FBI for your file, they start a file on you.
I have heard that, but I probably already. I mean, I had a file started on me during Bush because George W. Bush because I was on a list. I was a bad guy, which is hysterical because I like go to bed at 8 o'clock at night. Um, Yeah, so I mean, maybe that comes with risks. And so if you are up to something, maybe don't do it. But if you're just your kind of average person, I would be fascinated to see what shows up. I run my credit report every other year or so just to see what shows up. And sometimes I'm like, I don't even know what that is. Get that off there. Um, what kind of ideas or thoughts did you have to for people to be able to have just kind of basic conversations about surveillance, what they're doing with the information, how they're gathering it, what they're using it for? When we think about using other people's platforms with our pictures, whether it's Meta or Facebook, Instagram, um, those kind of things. What are your suggestions to normalize this as some kind of discussion topic?
Yeah, I guess like what really came up for me was kind of thinking about um yeah, just let me gather my thought here for a minute. My cat just decided to show up. Uh
So distracting
yeah,
cats.
totally. Um yeah, if I was trying to have a conversation with somebody where maybe they weren't on the same page as me, I think really what I would want to focus on or talk about is just I think that like the internet aspect of it. I think that we just interface with the internet so easily and openly now. I have teenagers, so they're 16 and 18, and the way they interface with the internet compared to me is like even more extreme, where like I mean their whole life is on there. And so thinking about if there are um, if there is like this move to start like identifying future threats, right? That I just keep going back to that, the idea of future threats, right? So like if my
Mhm.
18-year-old is like posting on the internet about like women's rights or abortion rights or trans rights, is that now like a future threat thing, you know?
Mm,
And
interesting.
so like really making sure we all have good like understanding of like internet safety in the sense of like protecting ourselves. Um, I think it also makes me think of like, last year in the spring when there was lots of protests on university campuses and people are getting arrested for expressing political opinions, right? Um, just starting to be aware and paying attention to that stuff. Um, I don't know if that's like super actionable like you're looking for, but I think just being realistic about this idea of um, free speech is a really important thing in this country. I think we all agree on that and making sure that we all have equal access to that um, without negative repercussions.
I mean, honestly, it's not even about like talking to someone that doesn't agree with you or doing some kind of like revolutionary act. I think if I've learned anything from doing this is that no one should read the whole thing because it's hard to recover from. And two is this is a portion of the community that I live with. And they're not like three weird guys who can type, right? Like this is a lot of people, and a lot of people don't understand what they're talking about. And I feel like if we're talking about freedom of speech or we're talking about protected speech or hate speech, what we really are talking about is facts
Mhm.
and truth. We need to refigure out what the truth is. And so what does Project 2025 actually say? Okay, what does this department actually do? And to your point, where is my information showing up? Because it's actually not just the internet. It's also telephones. It's financial transactions. Surveillance is cameras. Like when I think about how normalized it was when the man killed the United Health CEO, and it was just stated like, oh, it's really weird that you'd lose track of someone in New York City because there's so many surveillance cameras. And then they used people's security cameras and the city cameras, et cetera, to like trace his behavior. I don't know that I really have consciously thought about how much cameras are everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not necessarily doing something about it or making a statement about it or supporting legislation, although those are all things you can do. I really think that the my biggest takeaway from this chapter is I don't think I knew any of this. And that's my responsibility. So like how can we talk about what is seen and what isn't seen, and when we're relying on this stuff versus I might find it an invasion of privacy, and I then am going to rely on it because someone broke into my car. Like,
Mhm.
what's the line there? And then perhaps if we can take responsibility for where we find that line, we can understand the too far and the too little. Maybe that would help, like, I don't know, build up some empathy or some more like human centered rules um, that aren't just focusing on destroying China and the private sector.
Yeah. And I think even though it's not like clearly stated in this chapter, like it seems like there is this like shifting of like more of an internal focus, like national
Mhm.
internal focus of the intelligence community versus that external, right? And
Yeah.
so like to me that's like doesn't feel good, right? Like why are we so very ourselves, our neighbors, especially in this very divided like political climate where it is very
Mhm.
much like us versus them, right? And depending who's in office, like who are we
Yeah.
supporting, you
Yeah.
know?
The solution of us and them is not to pretend there's not a them,
Yeah.
right? It isn't just take your ball and go home, even though we now have 14 countries that we are happy to collaborate with. Um, every chapter is so full of contradictions. Well, Dylan, I know you
Yeah.
have someplace you have to go. I also have to go someplace. We don't have anything profound to say, I think, either of us, other than it's another chapter. It's another area where I am recognizing and taking responsibility that I was not paying attention and I didn't know what I didn't know. And now I at least know that there's a lot I don't know. And sometimes that's already a really big step. So
Mhm.
thank you again,
Yeah.
Dylan, for signing up to have this weird conversation with me. And I really, really, really do appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.